Hi, I'm Greg Krasovsky, an American attorney. I'm also a former first responder. I worked as a police officer, as an emergency rescue technician, as a fire rescue technician. I've also done research in neuropharmacology labs. I've helped set up biochemistry companies, including those who have done DNA and virological research. I've also helped set up and worked in disaster relief nonprofits. The reason why I mention all these things is today I want to talk to you about the legal services that my law office and the law offices that we work with, the lawyers that we work with around the world, can offer to you if you've been infected by the coronavirus, the Wuhan coronavirus of 2019. I've done a number of interviews on television about it, and when I first became aware of the epidemic, the most important thing for me with having my medical and research background was that once scientists saw that an average infected patient was infecting 2, 3, or 4 other patients, that's all I needed to know, because what it showed me is that it's going to be extremely difficult to contain this virus, especially since people were already becoming contagious before they showed serious symptoms like a fever, because this is a coronavirus that, unlike the cold virus, which first hits your upper respiratory tract, you get a stuffy nose. This one apparently starts to develop first in your lungs. So once you get a small innocuous cough, you're already spreading virus through droplets. And this is a virus that apparently can live, if you look at room temperatures, for up to 9 days on surfaces. But I'm not talking to you about it as some sort of a public health expert. What I want to talk to you about is as an attorney who understands these things and who can help protect you in your rights in the event that you're someone who has been affected by the coronavirus. Let's just go through the list of things that can happen to you. Let's say you're a resident in an area that's subject to quarantine. Your freedom of movement can be limited. You may not be able to get services that you need, especially medical services. You may have issues with your employer, going to work, not going to work, being able to use sick time. So we have labor law issues, being paid for the time that you missed. Issues with potential telecommuting, if that's appropriate or feasible, because it may not make sense to use public transportation when you have a potential epidemic. Or let's say you're someone who's been quarantined, maybe just based on suspicions. And quarantines can not just cause you, emotional pain and suffering, but financial losses if you can't go to work, if you can't manage your business. What if you're a sole proprietor and you have to do the work yourself, or you're an independent contractor or a freelancer these days? These may be relevant issues. What if you start not being able to make a flight that you've paid for? Right? You have issues with airline tickets, with train tickets, with other forms of transportation that you've paid for. What if you're a person who believes that they've been infected by the coronavirus by someone who knew that had it and should have disclosed it to you? You may be entitled to damage as well. So in terms of your legal rights, there are a number of issues that can come up, and you may want to talk to a lawyer. We've all seen the latest media coverage of the poor passengers on the Diamond Princess, right? The cruise ship that's been in quarantine in Japan. And the Japanese authorities' decision not to let anyone out without thinking ahead of time that, well, wait a minute. It's one thing if you're keeping people in cabins where they have windows and they can have proper ventilation. It's another thing when you're keeping people in the ship and in the interior cabins that don't have any windows and they're only getting their ventilation from the ship. And most of these ventilation systems are not going to be able to filter out viruses. So, this is like a breeding ground for additional coronavirus infections. Obviously, the Japanese authorities, their first and foremost task is to protect the population of Japan from the spread of coronavirus, from potentially infected passengers and crew. But there may have been better ways to go about it. Setting up quarantine facilities, outside the ship, even if it had to be within the port. You could have set up tent cities depending on the weather and your tent capabilities. You could have transferred people to military bases. I mean, let's look at Wuhan. They built a whole hospital in 10 days. That's Chinese ingenuity and industrialists for you. And I'm sure the Japanese could have done the same thing. Instead, what happened? The virus kept on spreading because it was on surfaces on the ship. It was being transmitted by patients. People already infected to people that they were in contact with. It was being transmitted through surfaces and through the ventilation system. So hopefully now they'll be able to get it under control without needlessly infecting other passengers and other crew members. But you can imagine what those passengers went through. Now, if some of those passengers, instead of just trying to handle this themselves, asked for the advice from a competent and experienced law firm or a lawyer, what could I or my colleagues have done for them? What we do every day. We represent people before third parties, before government authorities. We would have contacted the Japanese government, Japanese port officials, health officials, would have contacted U.S. consular officials to make sure that this was everyone's top priority. Not just to lift quarantine because someone doesn't want to be stuck in quarantine, but to minimize the risk of additional infections to people, both on the ship and in the surrounding communities and the communities where the passengers and the crew come from. So that's an issue. By the way, one of the areas that my office handles is immigration law. And now we have serious immigration law issues. Why? Well, let's look at U.S. policies. People who are from China are not being admitted to the U.S. Restrictions are being imposed. Not just people from that province where Wuhan is, but from China in general. Look at the number of Chinese students that are affected that are in the U.S. I think the latest count, we had 300,000 Chinese students in U.S. institutions of higher learning, and probably half of them didn't have a chance to come back before the travel ban was imposed on January 31st. Well, what are they going to do if they've made tuition payments or payments for room and board, and the educational facilities are refusing to, for instance, either reimburse those payments? I mean, this is a force majeure, right? This is obviously an extraordinary event. Or they're refusing to apply those payments to, let's say, their future semester. Hopefully they'll be able to return to study, if not this spring, then in the fall. And if they are allowed to return, let's say in the middle of the semester, what happens in terms of accommodating students for midterms that are missed, or for other, assigned work, or final exams. So this is another area where if you're someone who's affected by this, and you're afraid that you're going to incur losses, or your rights may have been violated, either as a consumer or as a provider of services, don't wait. Start talking to lawyers about your legal options and your legal rights to see what we can do for you. This goes with just as well for tour operators, for people who sell tours, for people who sell, as I've said before, airline tickets, cruise ship tickets. I think we're not going to see that many cruises or that part of the world for a while. Given the hysteria, and also what happened with that ship, the Westerdam, that was eventually allowed to disembark to release its passengers in Cambodia, and lo and behold, in a ship where they've made numerous assurances to port authorities they didn't have anyone infected on board, it turns out that they did have people infected on board. So now Cambodia has to deal with the damage control and containing any potential spread of the coronavirus, as well as the communities to which the Westerdam passengers and crew have returned. So that's an issue as well. As I've said, this affects transportation law, tourism, education, hospitality industry, medical service. You could even have potential medical malpractice lawsuits if you've been misdiagnosed or physicians have failed to diagnose you with the coronavirus when they should have. And this can have horrible consequences. People can die from complications. Number one complication is why people die from the flu and other related illnesses is pneumonia, basically. Or the heart just gives up. Or you can have an anaphylactic shock if the body is so full of toxins that this leads to organ failure. So if you think that there may be a medical malpractice issue, let us know. In terms of employment and labor issues, same thing. What if you're a medical service provider or you work for a transportation company and now you've been asked to treat coronavirus patients or suspected coronavirus patients or transport them or house them or feed them? You need to make sure that your employer has taken the proper measures for your safety. What if the employer hasn't? And you end up getting coronavirus, or your loved ones. You may have grounds for a lawsuit against your employer if they didn't take appropriate measures, if they didn't give you the proper training, they didn't provide you with the proper protective equipment. These are all serious issues. You're also going to have issues where people are now, disinfecting every potential surface. We've seen the footage from China where people are trying to disinfect, snow-covered streets. I'm sorry, it's a nervous laughter, but think about the chemicals that are being used to disinfect public areas. They're not healthy for you. Usually, often they're carcinogenic. Are the people who are doing the disinfecting work, do they have proper protective equipment in terms of proper respiratory masks? We see this over and over again in the industrial setting where employees are not given the proper masks with the appropriate level of protection to protect them from those particular chemicals that they're exposed to in the air. So it's one thing if you're given a mask that protects you against minute particles like dust or things like that, but it's not a mask that can filter out toxic or carcinogenic chemicals that can cause damage to your lungs, to your liver, to your kidneys, that can be carcinogenic and even potentially lead to cancer either now or 5 or 10 years from now. We've seen the risks of exposure to toxic chemicals back. Remember when we had the big BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico? And they used all sorts of chemicals to try to clean up the oil that was on the beaches and in the water. And those chemicals turned out to be extremely toxic and carcinogenic and led to a number of diseases that still can't be cured. You're going to have the same issues. So, as I've said before, coronavirus is going to affect us for the next year. Maybe it'll sputter out, maybe we'll be able to contain it, but I think what's going to happen is chances are every country is going to be exposed to it, because all it takes is one person who's infected, who travels to that country, before they show symptoms, before they're aware that they have more than just, a routine cough or a routine cold. And in that time period, they're going to infect people who may not be able to be identified and isolated. It's one thing, if someone has traveled by car and you know who they've traveled with, and you can identify these people and have them undergo testing or be quarantined. It's another thing if someone, who arrives in a country has been on an airplane with hundreds of passengers, and those people may have picked up the coronavirus from that patient zero, and they could have transmitted to other people at the airport, or in a local bus, or a subway, or a local shopping mall, school, hospital, store, workplace. Imagine some big office building. What if this is something that's got into the ventilation system in an office building where you've had one infected patient? So I think we need to look at the potential risks, and I don't mean to raise a false alarm or cause any undue paranoia, but I think we need to be realistic. This is going to affect everyone, and once it does, it's going to disrupt our daily lives. And depending on how everyone reacts, both the authorities as well as people who are part of the economy, this can affect people and can violate their rights. So if people start shutting down stores, shopping centers, transportation companies, whether it's taxis, cabs, buses, trains, it's going to cause a disruption. People may not be able to get to work or get the services that they need. Not to mention just, basic necessities like food and medicine. It's also going to place an undue strain on medical facilities. And often, medical service providers, doctors, nurses, physician's assistants who don't have experience in dealing with epidemics or pandemics, or they call it disaster medicine, may not be able to react appropriately. And this can compromise the quality of the screening work that they do, the quality of treatment. Some patients may be inappropriately denied or delayed treatment, causing complications and suffering and losses. Some patients could be erroneously identified as coronavirus carriers, with all the ensuing ramifications in terms of quarantine and things like that. So I think there's going to be work for attorneys who can represent the rights of those who've been affected by it and whose rights have been violated, either through negligence or through, well, you know what they say, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So often, trying to, with good intentions, people can violate the rights of others, do things that are inappropriate, that can cause damage, and from which the victim deserves compensation. But on a positive note, in terms of what we all should do, well, it's very clear. These days, listen, if you have cold symptoms, don't go to work. Stay home. If your children have cold symptoms, don't send them to school or daycare or kindergarten, because once you're out there and you're not wearing a mask and you're not washing your hands all the time and you're not wearing gloves, you're going to spread whatever you've got, whether it's virological or bacteriological. It doesn't matter, you're going to get other people sick. And people who are sick, needless to say, their immune system is already taxed and compromised. And heaven forbid that within your setting you also have the coronavirus. So, and then again, you may not even know whether you or someone else under your care has the coronavirus instead of just a regular cold. I had the swine flu back in, 2009? Because I was on legal business down in southern Texas by the Mexican border. And look, I'm lucky to be alive because I was in bed for 3 days and I couldn't even get my fever down. And then I was in bed for another 3 days just to make sure I didn't suffer from any complications, especially on the heart, or the kidneys or the liver, considering how much Tylenol I took and ibuprofen and stuff like that just to bring the fever down. So it's scary. It's something to think about. So we all need to do whatever we can do to prevent, especially over the next 6 months, the spread of any, contagious diseases, whether it's a cold or whether it's the flu. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, right? And also, if you see someone who you believe is showing symptoms of what could be a coronavirus or other serious diseases that are a public threat, such as, for instance, tuberculosis, then say something. I remember how I picked up the swine flu. I got on a plane and the airlines were already telling people, if you have a fever, don't travel. We're not going to let you on board. A woman from Mexico sat next door to me and we're already taking off. The flight was full to capacity. And I noticed that, she looked sick. She was pale. She was sweating. And she barely spoke in English. I said, hello, are you sick? Are you okay? Do you have a fever? And I know she was hiding a mask in her purse. And I said, oh, come on, please. You should have not come on board this plane. And there's nothing we could do because there was no other place to sit her or to separate her from other passengers. So who in turn probably, aside from me, also became future swine flu patients. But that's an example. If you see something, say something. If you're parents and you have children who are sick, don't send them to school. Because they're going to get other children sick. And you may say, well, what am I going to do? Who's going to sit home with them? Right? That's a big issue. If you have both parents working, well, talk to your employer. See if they're willing to compromise on this. Given the current situation and the threat of coronavirus, and just even the flu itself. And if they'll accommodate you staying home with your child, working from home part-time. Telecommuting is a realistic option for many professions these days that don't require your physical presence in the workplace. That's something to do. And then again, if you're sick and you're out there, wear a mask, wear gloves, sneeze in your elbow, do all the things people tell you to do to prevent the transmission of whatever disease you have to others. If you are someone who is the owner or the manager of a facility that provides services to the public, whether it's a transportation company, stores, other places, then maybe you should put up signs. You should instruct your employees how to remind people, how to accommodate people. Have hand sanitizer available, have disposable masks available, gloves available, not just for employees but also for your patrons, for your customers. That may be very useful. So I think we all need to contribute, and in this way things will be safer. But if you suspect you have the coronavirus, make sure you get the medical treatment that you need, ASAP. And obviously everyone's going to be afraid to make that phone call, since quarantine measures will be imposed upon you and upon the people you live or work with. But I think, in the greater picture, that's the lesser of the two evils. Then if you don't put people on alert and get other people sick needlessly, infect other people needlessly. So if you have any questions about your legal responsibilities and your legal rights, don't hesitate. I always say this, right? Call a lawyer, whether it's me or someone else. Make sure they're competent. Make sure they're experienced. They understand these issues. Hopefully they have a medical background or a first responder background or a research background and understand what they're dealing with. And they'll be able to help you out. On a brighter note, just to give you a tidbit, I remember back when I was working in the lab at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, one of the things we were doing, this was in the mid-'80s, we're working on, one of the labs that I worked in was working on the sequencing of the HIV virus, right, that causes AIDS. And imagine how cautious you have to be with that. But let's look at what happened later on. People were able to come up with viable, with affordable treatment to HIV. And lots of people were saved. And are living today pretty much virus-free, thanks to the antiviral cocktail of drugs that they're taking. So, given any virus, even though they mutate, even though they spread, even from, right, they make that interspecies jump, we still have an opportunity to get this thing under control. Once that Wuhan coronavirus is probably genetically sequenced, and we know exactly what we're dealing with, regardless of its origin. Because origins that's a big issue, right? Yes, sometimes they're transmitted from animals to humans. They become more virulent. Once you have human-to-human transmission, they can also mutate. Sometimes these viruses escape laboratories where people are doing legitimate studies on them. People talked about Wuhan having a virological center, and I have no idea whether that has anything to do with it. But regardless, we get virulent disease, these viruses, and we have to deal with them. People start working on vaccines. People start studying the virus. People start working about treatment measures, what are the most effective in terms of antiviral therapy, which is difficult. Often, you just let the virus run its course, especially things like, cold viruses or related coronaviruses. But we go through it. For historical perspective, we did have the Spanish flu epidemic back in 1918. This was toward the end of World War I. No, it didn't originate in Spain. From what I've read, it originated probably in pig farms in Kansas, and then was transmitted to people and carried all over the world by steamships. And why were steamships so effective in helping spread the Spanish flu? Because in the old days, when you had the ships with sails would take you 3 or 4 weeks to cross the sea or across the ocean, and by that time the virus ran its course and everyone on the ship already had it and got better or died from it. But with steamships, you could cross, the ocean in a week, and lots of people could get the virus and spread it to other people. Now we have even worse than steamships. We have airplanes and high-speed trains that can transmit diseases with passengers around the world within 12 hours. You think of it. These days, from pretty much any place in the world, you can fly to all the way to the other side of the earth in 24 hours with transfers or with direct flights that they have now, right? With long-range passenger planes, jet planes. So we just have to be more cautious, but we have to be prudent and also realize that a virus, like anything else, if it's too destructive, it's not going to transmit itself, because once patients die too fast, they can't really transmit it. That's the good news. It's the scary thing about things like the Ebola virus. But getting back to the Spanish flu, the bad news with that virus was that you cause such a horrible hyperactive response from your immune system, and lots of people died from complications because they would get blood in their lungs. And not that the virus was causing their lung cells to burst, but their own immune system, their own body was releasing blood in an attempt to somehow fight the virus. And we know in 1918 it wasn't man-made. It was just a virus that happened to develop. But it's been gone for so many years because lots of people had it, they went through it, and it went away. I think with the coronavirus, we're going to get the same thing. But in the meantime, let's just do everything we can to make sure we don't get sick, we don't get anyone else sick, take appropriate measures, and we did the right thing in terms of fulfilling our rights and responsibilities as citizens, as patients, as employers or service providers, especially if quarantine measures are enacted or appropriate. Thank you. If you need help, always give us a call. Try to give you advice.